developed the field of ecclesiology with a particular interest in international relations. And today he will highlight the understanding of what church means by addressing the theme scaffolds of a church, which is the name of his most recent book, I think. I think Cyril can be able to show this.
That is the book, yeah.
Yes. Where he will more or less address the difference between what is the nature of a church and what is accidental for a church, which can be changed and be brought up to discussion through the various times of history. But I think it's better for Cyril to present his lecture directly. So I welcome you, Professor Havaroun, and I leave the floor open for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I think this was a great initiative, great idea to have public lectures. Sometimes instead of the online conversations with the classes, which are not much populated now in the time of pandemic. So I think I thank you for this idea. And so let me start. As you mentioned, indeed, I'm going to talk about the church, the phenomenon of the church. It fits the course that I'm teaching this semester. It's on ecclesiology and international relations. And I would probably show again the book that I'm going to explore, this book, Scaffolds of the Church. And let me explain briefly what brought me to writing this book. Actually, what brought me to write this book was a dilemma and a difficulty in understanding what is going on with the church. Because on the one hand, all of us, we believe in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is holy, which is infallible, which does not err, which sanctifies people, and is supposed to be blameless. And on the other hand, we all experience, well, if we have a good reason and we have our eyes with us, and we are not driven by concepts, but we can see reality. We can see the reality of the church, which errs, which has its vulnerabilities, which has its deficiencies. So the question was how to reconcile these two aspects of the church. Are we talking about the same church, or we're talking about two different churches? One is the church we believe in, and another one is the church that we belong to. Is it a similar church? Is it the same church, or it's a different church? I think many of us face this dilemma at different stages, and I found it helpful that maybe my answers that I try to figure out could help others to answer the same questions. So what helped me to answer these questions was to differentiate between two aspects of the church. Well, it was not a new idea, of course, and as I studied the evolution of different ideas about the church, and actually I studied this evolution of ecclesial ideas, ecclesiological ideas in my previous book, this one, it's called Ecclesiology. So this book essentially explores different ideas about the church. So as I explored different ideas about the church, the meta-ecclesiology, I realized that it was very common to differentiate between two aspects of the church. And there were different names given to those two aspects. For instance, the church visible and invisible, the church militant and glorified, and so forth and so on. I suggested my own kind of approach to this binarity of the church, of the phenomenon of the church, if you want. And I applied a more kind of traditional framework, which was usually applied when Eastern theologians in the past faced difficulties, issues, theological issues. what they did usually when they faced theological issues was to apply the categories of logics. The categories that were borrowed from the manuals of logics, dialectical manuals, that provide instruments to understand different phenomena. Like, for instance, when the theologians face the problem how the oneness and plurality can be reconciled in God, how one God can be also simultaneously three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They applied exactly this framework of logics. Particularly, they employed this differentiation borrowed from the pagan Neoplatonic, essentially, logics between the commonality and particularity, between the common and particular natures. So they apply this differentiation between commonality and particularity, and in this way explain the Trinity as three particular persons and one common nature. They face the same problem when they try to interpret the incarnation, Jesus Christ, and they also said that Jesus Christ is one particularity, his personality, and he also has commonalities which are humanity and divinity. So this differentiation between particularity and commonality, I found it helpful to apply to the church as well. I took from the nomenclature, from the list of different categories, two particular categories: the category of a nature, of a common nature, and the category of its accident, its property. Well, I need probably to say a few words to explain the difference between them. So in the traditional dialectical framework, which goes back to Aristotle, was then elaborated upon by Neoplatonic philosophers such as Porphyry, and was appropriated later on by the Christian theologians. They explained how they used the idea of the essence as a common nature, commonality that unites different particularities, like the common nature of human beings, of all humans, and particular human beings like Peter, Sarah, John, and so forth. So they differentiated between, as I said, mentioned particularity and commonality on the one hand, and in the commonality, the common nature, they differentiated different properties. There are some natural properties, like, for instance, for a human being, it's like to walk on two legs. Or I like this example, which was quite common in the Byzantine logical categories, the example of laughing. The logicians, Byzantine logicians, they thought that the particular a specific property that identifies all human beings and that identifies the entire human nature is the ability of laughing. So if you laugh, it means you are a human being, and only human beings can laugh. That was their point. So that was a natural kind of property. And in addition to that, the logicians identified an accident. They called accident in the Greek with the Greek word symbevikos. They considered symbevikos an accident as different from property, natural property. Property they called with the Greek word piotis or piotita, like laughing is a piotita, is a natural quality of the human beings. But accident is something that changes while a human being lives, develops. Like, for instance, all human beings have hair on their head, like this one, right? And as they live, this hair changes its qualities. It becomes gray, like mine, or it falls and the person becomes bald. So all those qualities that change during the human life have been identified as accidents. So I applied this differentiation between accidents and the nature. Like take hair is a feature of the human nature, but when hair becomes gray, it's an accident. So I employed this differentiation between the accident and the nature to explain the church. My point is that there is a nature of the church. The nature of the church does not change, it remains the same. And in parallel to that nature, there are accidents. There are some qualities, some aspects of the church life that all the time change. They emerge and they disappear or they evolve. To identify what belongs to the nature and what belongs to the accidents of the church, I employed another argument from the Christological debates. In the time of the Christological controversies, an argument was employed that speaking about Jesus Christ, that what belongs to the nature or natures of Jesus Christ. I know that we disagree with our Oriental brothers on numbering the natures in Jesus Christ, but it's not now it's not the subject of our discussion now. Nevertheless, they agreed, both the Oriental, I mean the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Christians, theologians at the time, that the nature or natures of Christ, they don't change, they cannot change, they remain the same. The nature of Christ remains the same from the moment it was conceived. And well, they disagreed on how many natures did Christ have, but they agreed that the nature is unchangeable. So this is a kind of bottom line that we can apply to ecclesiology, and we can identify as the nature of the church everything in the church and the history of the church that never changed. Consequently, those things in the history of the church that changed, we can identify as not belonging to the nature of the church, as accidents, as something that evolves all the time, changes all the time in the history of the church. From this perspective, for instance, I would identify the faith in Jesus Christ as pertinent to the nature of the church, because the church always had faith in Jesus Christ. Or the Holy Scripture also always belonged to the church. Therefore, it is an intrinsic part of the ecclesial being, of the ecclesial nature. Or a community. The church always had communities. Therefore, communities are necessarily a part of the church's nature. Let me explain the difference between the nature and the accidents of the church by other examples that I just figured out that could be helpful to understand this difference. In this book that I've shown to you, the scaffolds of the church, I employ the idea of scaffolding. Those structures that constructors build around the building in order to build it or to maintain an edifice. And on this picture, on the cover page of the book, you can see the building of the church and the scaffolding surrounding the building. So my point was that there is a nature of the church, something that doesn't change, like these kind of walls and structures of the building of the church itself, and the scaffolding around it, which helps to maintain the church. At the same time, it's not a part of the building. It's not a part of the nature of the church. So that is kind of my point, that there is the nature of the church that doesn't change, that doesn't err, that doesn't fall, doesn't collapse, doesn't disappoint. And there are the structures, those scaffoldings that surround the church and then can collapse. They are temporarily, they can be mounted and dismounted. They can be relocated to a different place. So they constantly evolve, they constantly change. And that is, I think, an image that explains my point about the difference between the natures and the accidents of the church. Or another example, imagine that the church is like a excuse me, a solar system, and the sun is in the center of the solar system, and it is the source of light. We know that the sun is the only source of light, and other elements of the solar system, like planets, like moons, they only receive and reflect this sunlight coming from the sun. They don't shine themselves; they just reflect the shining of the sun. In the same exactly sense, the nature of the church is like the sun that shines, that is the source of light, and the ecclesial structures, they are like planets or moons that reflect this sunshine, but they are not the source of light themselves. Or allow me another example to mention to explain the difference between the nature and the accidents of the church. I know that there are, and we all know that there are debates about, the idea of the creation of the world and to what extent what role evolution plays in the life on Earth. It's an ongoing debate, and even now some churches are very heavily involved in those debates. So I think that the juxtaposition of the creationist theory and of the evolutionist theory can help us to explain the phenomenon of the church as well. I would argue that the nature of the church is something which has been created by God, which comes from God, from the hands of God, as it were. And just as the world which God has created is good, is pure, is not penetrated by evil, is not alienated by evil. It's something that, just like the matter, it is something good. It is something as created by God, positive and blemishless. But it has been created by God. And there are things in this world which constantly change, which evolve, and therefore they are subject to evolution. And those things that change in the world are like those structures in the church. So the church is like the matter of this world, which has come from God and which is therefore good. And the structures of the church are like the things in this world which evolve. So if we combine these creationist and evolutionist theories, we can explain the phenomenon of the church as well. I mentioned already the features of the nature of the church. As I said, we can identify those features as invariables in the church. Like, in the mathematics, in calculus, there are variable values and invariable values. So the nature of the church is like invariable values in the equation. They do not change, and they never changed in the history. And we can identify, if we can identify things that never changed in the history of the church, as I said, we can identify also the nature of the church, because those features belong to the nature of the church, like faith in Jesus Christ, like the scripture, like communities, like sacraments, like Eucharist. the church always had Eucharist, always had sacraments. It started as a sacramental phenomenon, and therefore the sacraments do belong to the nature of the church. Unlike these invariable values in the church, there are things, as we also mentioned, which are variable, which change, which evolve, which develop all the time. And those things belong exactly to the accidents of the church. Let me explore in more detail those accidents or those structures of the church. They were invented in the church in order to facilitate building the edifice of the church, and in order to facilitate the maintaining of the integrity of the church. They were constructed exactly to sustain the church's unity, something which is very important in the church. The original rationale, therefore, was exactly to help, to serve the church. For this reason, exactly, some structures were invented to keep communities together. We said the communities constitute the core of the church. They are at the nature of the church. I call communities also the church's hypostasis, in which sense that hypostasis, as we know, is, according to the classical Christian definition, is a real individual being, existence. It is real, it is individual, and it participates in the common nature. So the communities are like those hypostases, which participate in the common nature of the church, in the ousia of the church, as it were. So in order to keep those hypostases of the church, the communities together, the church introduced some supracommunal structures. Originally, they were quite primitive, like, for instance, a network of communities. Such networks were established by Paul, by John, by Ignatius of Antioch, for instance, by whom our school is named. Later on, they evolved to some more complicated structures like metropolises, dioceses, and eventually patriarchates. So those supracommunal structures, I believe, they constitute the scaffolding, the accidents of the church, because they always change, they continue changing. They're like hair on our head. From black they turn gray, and then they fall away. So they change, and therefore their role is auxiliary, supporting. They're supposed to maintain, to sustain the integrity of the church. Another structure that I'd like to highlight is related to an important feature of the church's life, which is ministry. Ministry is, I believe, ministry belongs to the nature of the church, because communities of faithful, of people, they had to be ministered sacraments always. They had to be taken care, pastoral care of. For this purpose, ministry existed all the time, since the time of Jesus Christ, who was the first minister of the church. However, some forms of ministry were supporting, were auxiliary, were exactly having the features of a structure of the church, of an accident of the church. And I believe a form, probably one of the most popular forms of unity, of ministry in the church has become hierarchical ministry. Hence is now long-lasting debate about where we should place hierarchy. Does hierarchy belong to the nature of the church, or it is pertinent to to the structures. It is one of the structures of the church, of those scaffoldings around the church. The Orthodox are not agreeing on this. And I believe that, generally speaking, ecumenically speaking, different Christian groups would disagree with one of those points. My, however, approach to this is that hierarchy as a form of ministry is not pertinent to the nature of the church. It emerged in the church as a response to the growing structures of the church, to the growing communities of the church, to the expansion of Christianity across the Roman Empire. And as a response, it was a temporarily measure, as it were, to help communities to grow. And we know from the theory of hierarchies, hierarchical structures, from the theory of organizations, that hierarchies are indispensable for the growing organizations. The more complicated an organization becomes, the more sophisticated hierarchy it requires. It's a kind of axiom in the organization theories. So as the church grew as an organization, it required hierarchy to sustain the integrity of the complex structures of the communities that had very complex interrelations with one another. So that's how hierarchy emerged, and it emerged as a structure of the church, as a scaffolding around the church. Moreover, the hierarchy was modeled by the examples taken from the secular or pagan environment. I argue that the idea of hierarchy was introduced through Neoplatonism to Christianity by the authors like St Ignatios, the Areopagite, who borrowed heavily from the Neoplatonic thinking, particularly from the philosophers, from the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus. Proclus, like other Neoplatonic philosophers, he believed in many gods. He was a very convinced polytheist. And the Neoplatonic philosophers tried to sort out those many gods they believed in to different ranks, to different tiers, as it were. And they created a scheme, a hierarchical scheme, where they placed different gods in that scheme. They also explored their being, the world, in the hierarchical terms. Let me share with you a scheme that I've drafted that explains the hierarchy in Proclus, the hierarchy of being in Proclus. So you can see this. Excuse me, I'll just this scheme here, and that's how Proclus understood the hierarchy of the world, starting with the material world, going to different various of intellectual and bodiless layers in the world, and reaching the one. This scheme, I believe, resembles very much, or it is resembled in the scheme which Christian theologians drew, including Dionysius the Areopagite. Let me show you. So this is the scheme of God perceived in the Christian theology, and in Christ, in the church, and the different layers of the church. You can see the Trinity has become, and the relations between the persons of the Trinity have become a model to understand Christ, and the model to understand church. And the structure of the church here, the hierarchical structure of the church, exactly resembles the hierarchical structure of the being as it has been perceived and presented by Proclus. So that is kind of a similarity that I find, and I think it is quite a striking similarity. Right. Another structure that I'd like to present to you is very much debated nowadays in the Orthodox world. It is the structure of autocephaly. For many people, autocephaly is like almost a fetish, and people believe in it with their whole heart, or they reject it with their whole heart. It's really like almost like a sacred symbol, like a fetish, and some people venerate it. Others reject it and want to, to burn it and to destroy it. It is happening, as you probably know, around in connection with the events in Ukraine. My point is that there is nothing sacred about autocephaly. It's just one of those helpful auxiliary instruments that helped historically the church to build itself, to sustain its unity. Therefore, the main purpose of autocephaly is to sustain the unity of the church. Autocephaly evolved. I've even drawn an evolution tree of autocephaly, and I'd like to share it with you to demonstrate how evolution works in application to the church's structures. So here it is. Let me show it to you. So that is, I'll close down this one. Let me show you. So I hope you can see it, right? So you see, this is the evolution tree of autocephaly. It started growing from the early Christianity, then in the late antiquity, it led to the formation of the Church of Cyprus. And then in the Middle Ages, it led to the formation of the Church of Bulgaria, Serbia, Moscow. In the same period of time, two autocephalous churches, the Church of Rome and Constantinople, separated from each other. And I believe autocephaly also contributed to the Reformation. And some churches of the Reformation emerged out in the West as autocephalous churches, reclaiming their autocephaly. But it's kind of a different story. And then in the modern era, autocephalous churches continued growing from different trunks, as you can see. Some autocephalous churches sprang from the Church of Constantinople, some from Moscow. Maybe some churches will spring from the Church of Serbia. Who knows? So this is how the idea of autocephaly, the institute of autocephaly, grew in the history. And I think this is a good illustration that structures of the church, they are evolutionary. They're subjects to evolution, to evolve, to development. They change all the time, and this is their kind of intrinsic feature. Another structure that I'd like to share with you, it's a bit funny. I hope I will not scandalize you. This is the structure which is also important in the modern inter-Orthodox developments, is the structure of canonical territory. Some churches, some hierarchs believe that canonical territory is almost like the apostolic principle, just like any territorial principle of the church is like apostolic. Remember, we like to repeat that that the church lives by the principle that in one city should be one bishop, which is of course not so, because the early church did not have this principle. This principle emerged quite later, and it reflected the principle of the Roman imperial organization, where one administrator had to be in one city. There could not be two administrators, Roman administrators, in one city. So the church just replicated this principle for its own being. So in the same sense, the well, many bishops and theologians believe that or that canonical territory is also kind of embedded in the very nature of the church. That's why they fight for autocephaly, for canonical territory, which is equal to autocephaly. This is the territory of the autocephalous churches. So they fight for the canonical territory as for, for the sacred grounds, as something, as for relics, something holy, something sacred. For many, this canonical territory has become a sacred object they venerate, and if they feel that they lose it, they really get upset, and they are ready to excommunicate each other, to break communion, to stop sharing Eucharist with those who, as they said, as they believe, imposed on their canonical territory. So all these kind of fights in the modern Orthodox world, they happen over the canonical territories, effectively. The churches fight for canonical territories. And it is quite strange why it is so. Because canonical territories are not holy, they are not sacred, they are something different. In the meantime, they are treated as holy grounds. Let me illustrate the way how the canonical territory is treated nowadays in the modern Orthodox world by some funny pictures. 2 years ago, I had a chance to be in Japan, in Tokyo, and I attended the international tournament of sumo, this traditional Japanese fight sport with, big boys trying to push each other from the arena, from the ground, common ground. And it happens like this. I will show you some funny pictures if you allow me to. Just one sec. So here it is. You see, I've taken this picture. So the idea of the fight is there is this sacred ground here in the center, which, by the way, resembles the Shinto temple. And this arena for sumo is built by the model of a Shinto temple. Then those two sumo fighters, they essentially claim each one this territory for themselves, and they do it by stepping on this ground like this guy. And the idea is that they claim this sacred ground for themselves, and then they try to push each other from this sacred ground, like in the video that I'm going to show you right now. So this is a piece of the video. Well, when I was watching this fight, it struck me that how similar it is to what the Orthodox churches nowadays do in fighting each other over territories. They really, like those sumo fighters, they try to push away each other from the ground that they consider sacred and as their canonical territory. And well, we can take it seriously in the Orthodox world, but people outside, they don't take it seriously. They look at us as we look at those sumo fighters that in a very funny way try to push out each other from the arena. So that's exactly what happens. We become livestock with the Orthodox when we treat the structures of the church, like canonical territories or other structures, as something sacred, as something given by God, as something pertinent to the very nature of the church. And we fight for those structures, our holy wars. And we forget about what is really important in the church. We forget about the very nature of the church. We are ready to sacrifice for the sake of those structures, those temporarily scaffoldings. We are ready to sacrifice what is really important in the church, like the unity of the church, like the integrity of us Christians, like the common witness that we have to deliver to the world outside us, outside the church. So I believe that it is important to distinguish between the nature of the church and the scaffoldings, the structures, the accidents of the church, in order exactly to deliver a meaningful message to the world outside the church, to explain for ourselves what is going in the church. And I believe also it is a good ground, good basis for a critical approach to the church. It gives us an answer, a hint how to answer the question whether we are allowed to criticize the church, whether critiquing the church is not a sin, but maybe something different, maybe something more positive. And I believe that if we differentiate between the nature and the structures of the church, then we can limit ourselves in our critiquing and make our critiquing really meaningful and helpful. We are not supposed to critique the nature of the church. It's given from God, by God, and it's really holy. It's really sacred. It's something which we long for, which we aspire for, which that is the reason why we belong to the church, after all. But at the same time, we live surrounded by those scaffoldings, by those structures, and they are human inventions. They have been created by human beings. They are handmade, and as such, they are fallible, they are vulnerable, they are criticable, they can be deconstructed, if you want, and they can be critiqued. And if we criticize them, critiquing those structures, if we do it in a constructive way, in a benevolent way, we can improve them, we can help them, we can restore them. Critiquing the structures of the church is like using the scaffolding around the edifice. The scaffolding around a building are meaningless if they stay on their own, if they are not populated by workers who climb on them, who do some work on them, who try to use them in order to sustain the unity of the church. So climbing and walking and working on those scaffoldings, it's like critiquing the church, the structures of the church. It contributes to the restoration of the church's integrity, to the restoration of its standing in this world. This is the basis of what we and Michael call critical ecclesiology. So they are crucially important, the scaffoldings, and it is crucially important also to analyze them and even to criticize them, to make them sound, to make them working, functional again, to make them correspondent to their rationale. Well, that's what I would like to share with you as my part of the lecture. And now I think it's time to move to Q&A, right, Michael?
Yes, thank you so much, Cyril. I will invite everyone to use the chat function to send me questions. You can send it for everyone or directly to me, Michael Yen. And I will address these questions by gathering them together and ask the questions to Professor Havarun. So use the chat now for questions, and I would appreciate to have a lot of questions so we have some time to have a thorough discussion. So I will wait a minute before I start the questioning. So. Let's take let's take the first question, because I think it's a very good one. How could we differentiate between the scaffolding and the more eternal things of a church?
Yes, by analyzing them against criteria. It's a theological work. So it's a matter for theological analysis. And of course, this analysis is arbitrary. It's not. It should not be taken as the voice of the church as such. It's just the voice of theologians. At the same time, in the history of the church, we had some authoritative formulations, definitions that clearly stated what is the nature of the church. I believe that the Nicene definition of the church, that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, those are the features that describe the nature of the church, not the structures of the church, but the nature of the church. So that is a hint for us where to go if we want to find the difference between the natures and the nature and the structures of the church. Otherwise, yes, we can speculate on this, as I do. I do not pretend to be, the oracle that reveals what is the nature and what are the structures of the church. Those are my suggestions, what we can see as the structures and the nature of the church. And we can discuss, and you can criticize what I suggest, and we can probably agree on a new list of the church structures, which is kind of a normal work for theologians, something that St Ignatios, I think, is doing and will continue doing. But, well, this work has to be done.
Yeah, let's continue, because we have a lot of interesting questions that are really on the edge of the interesting thing. But the second question would be, you're talking about the church, but it's not just a simple gathering of people for service. Could you expand more on what would be the church for the scaffolds and the nature of church together? What is it? Is it an institution, or what is it?
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, first of all, I want to say that we cannot separate the scaffolding from the nature of the church. And what may help in this regard is another differentiation in the nomenclature of the logical categories of the past. The logicians, including the fathers of the church, they differentiated between the distinction and separation. That distinction is a function, is an operation, intellectual operation. When we differentiate in our mind, in our imagination, a difference between things that cannot be separated in the real life. Like, for instance, and that's how the fathers argue, that we can only distinguish between the persons of the Trinity and the persons and Trinity, the gods of Sia, or we can only distinguish between divinity and humanity in Christ, but we cannot separate them. In the same sense, we cannot separate the structures of the church from the nature of the church. We cannot have, so to say, a bare kind of nature, naked nature of the church. It's impossible. The church is always surrounded by those structures, and we cannot really separate them. We can only distinguish them. And distinction, as I said, it's an intellectual process. It's a very speculative process. That's why what we are doing here is we are speculating, and this is the kind of the essence of our work. And again, as I said, we can speculate on what belongs to the structures and what belongs to the nature, and we can disagree on this, and this is absolutely fine. I'm very happy to receive, critique and to receive new suggestions what belongs to the structures of the church, but we should discuss it anyways.
Yet another question is a follow-up to this from one of the questioners, and that's the scaffolding. It's where, if you build a church or if you build a building, so to say, we need scaffolding in order to build it. But it means that the scaffolding is almost part of the nature, or in what way are the accidents of a church, so to say, necessary for the nature of a church?
Yeah. Yeah, they are not necessarily for the nature of the church. The nature of the church can exist without the scaffolding, without the accidents. In other ways, say the church can exist without the system of dioceses, or without that particular system of governance that has been invented in the history of the church, like the system of patriarchates. It's quite coincidental that we have this system of patriarchies. We might have had a completely different system. I don't know. We could might have call it in a very different way. Like for instance, we had a system of metropolitans and dioceses. Dioceses not in the modern sense, but in the Roman sense. Dioceses in the Roman Empire were big units, territorial units, which were used as units for governing the church. And the church in the 4th century adopted this system of dioceses in the proper sense, in the Roman sense, to govern itself. It did not last for a long time. It was substituted gradually by the patriarchal system, and only the name of the system stayed in the church. That's why we call our units, kind of territorial units of our churches, as dioceses, which is a borrowing from the Roman political language. So it was a historical coincidence, if you want, that we have the system that we have now, the administrative system of the church that we have now. It means that it might have been completely different. And it means that the church might have existed without it altogether, completely. The church doesn't need them. And the church adopted them. The church developed them for a very practical reason. The church grew, communities grew, the numbers of communities grew. They had to interact with one another. And in order to facilitate this interaction, the church developed those structures. So that's why they are auxiliary, they are helpful, they are helpers, those structures, but they are not intrinsically necessarily for the church. The scaffolding is not a part of the building. Moreover, I would say the scaffolding always makes a building ugly. The building per se, as such, is beautiful, and we often don't see the beauty of the building behind the scaffolding. Probably this explains why people don't like the church nowadays, because they look at the scaffolding and they see it's ugly. It's very kind of technical, very constructivist, if you want, not constructive, constructivist, and it's not beautiful. But you need to look behind the scaffolding in order to see the beauty of the building, the beauty of the church.
And the follow-up of this would be, if you take, for example, the case with Ukraine and other parts where, in history we had a church taking over a territory and expelling another previous actor. It's something, the practice here. Is it something that we should accept as just a scaffolding, or is it something that is worth fighting for? Or, if you take the sumo wrestlers as an example, should we accept the power of someone else who is more powerful? Or
yeah, well, that's what is happening. We are like sumo wrestlers, but I don't think we have to be like that. And I think territory is not worthy fighting, in no way. What is worthy fighting are people, are communities. So I think we need to keep in mind the well-being of communities, primarily of the people of the church, in order to decide whether it is worthy to fight or not worthy to fight. When territories are treated as more important than communities, when communities, so to say, are thrown under the bus of the territory, it's not really a fight worthy fighting. And that is what is happening often in our fights over canonical territories, that we throw communities under the bus of territories, and we essentially betray the original meaning of the structures. And that is one of the problems of the structures of the church. They become, instead of being helpers, they become obstacles. They become troublemakers for the church when they change, when they betray the original rationale. The original rationale of all structures of the church is to serve communities, to serve the nature of the church, to serve the unity of the church. If the structures of the church begin cutting into pieces the unity of the church, when the structures of the church begin sacrificing communities and well-being of communities for the sake of their own well-being, that is a trouble. That is a malfunctioning of the structures of the church. That is something that needs to be corrected, I believe. And in the history, we should not forget that in the history, it happened quite often that when the structures grew to the size and to the idea of being more important than the church itself, it always caused troubles. I believe, for instance, that pandarchy, the famous pandarchy, as the system of the organization of the ancient church into 5 patriarchates, which was a very helpful system. At some point it broke, and it broke also the church. Like the Great Schism between the Oriental and the Byzantine churches was essentially a division between 2 sets of patriarchates. On the one hand, Rome, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. On the other hand, Alexandria and Antioch. So without pandarchy, probably the schism would not have happened. Well, we now speculate, of course, but I believe that the system of pandarchy contributed to the Great Schism in the 5th century. It also contributed to the Great Schism in the 11th century because the 2 patriarchates, major patriarchates of the time, Constantinople, Rome, could not find common language. They argued with one another on very, very kind of unsubstantial issues, and they sacrificed their unity for the sake of their own interests. That is an example of how the structures of the church, growing larger than the essence, than the nature of the church, can damage the church, the unity of the church.
But if you continue along this line, in the lecture you promoted the idea that the scaffolds are therefore promoting growth and unity of a church.
They are supposed to. That is their original meaning. But the problem with them is that they are vulnerable. They can fall, and they fall in the sense that they turn against their nature. They betray their original meaning, their original rationale, and then they become dangerous for the church. And that's why they need to be repaired. And that's why critical ecclesiology is needed, exactly to produce blueprints and to produce instruments to repair those damaged and damaging structures of the church.
But if the scaffolds are to promote growth and unity, they seem to be very strongly attached to the nature of a church, or at least they're supposed to be very strongly attached.
Well, moreover, they sometimes are identified with the nature of the church. They're believed to be more important than the nature of the church. Like, take, for instance, the idea of primacy, another structure that I believe is just a structure, not the nature of the church, primacy. The churches fight for primacy, and they break communion for the sake of primacy. And that is exactly the result of the churches identifying primacy, one of the structures of the church, with the church itself. So that is the problem. When the structures of the church are identified with the church as such, this leads to troubles. This leads to different abuses of the church's structures and eventually endangers the church's integrity.
But could then you accept that scaffolds should be sustainable? Or are they just temporary in a very, let's say, shallow sense? Or are we supposed to build scaffolds that should be sustainable?
Well, that's exactly my point, that the scaffolds are vulnerable. That's why they constantly, permanently need to be sustained. They need to be repaired. They are not, God-sent divine institutions. If they were constructed by God, they didn't have to be repaired. We didn't have to care about them. We just had to rely on them, to believe that they are God-sent, that they are divine institutions, and they save us, automatically without any our effort. The problem with the scaffolds is that they are vulnerable. They are human institutions. Well, I call them, they are the institutions built by the human beings who believe in God, who are inspired by God, but still they are built by human hands. Therefore, they need to be repaired all the time. And moreover, I would say that this is a task for each generation in the church. It's a very edifying, a very nourishing task for the church members. We have to face difficulties, problems in the church. Each generation faces its own problems in the church and needs to apply some effort to improve this the situation, the condition of the scaffolds. Well, to some extent, you can compare it with, Sisyphus labors. When Sisyphus have to, to bring this huge stone up all the time, and meaning that he can never reach the top of the mountain. We can never reach the point when we can say that the structures of the church are done. They are functioning well. They don't need any reparation, any further maintenance. We cannot reach this point. Every generation has to do the same task to repair, to deal with the vulnerabilities and failures of the church's structures. That's how we grow as Christians. That's how we grow as the church. This is probably providential that we have these scaffolds of the church, because they teach us to be good members of the church.
It seems that there's some kind of tension here in your argument. On one side, you would argue that the nature of it doesn't really need a scaffold. On the other hand, you're arguing for a kind of sustainable scaffolds that are in constant need of repairing. It's like Sisyphus needs to carry this stone up to the top of a mountain. It's part of quotation nature of what he's doing.
Yeah.
Would it be in any case possible to talk about the nature without the scaffolds?
Yes, we can only speculate about the nature of the church. We cannot see or touch the nature of the church, as it were. It's impossible. We cannot do that. It's a very imaginative kind of process, intellectual process. That's why I emphasize that this differentiation between the scaffolding and the nature, it's just a distinction. It's not separation. We cannot, come and we cannot say that here, this is the pure church and the rest is rubbish. The rest is scaffolding. We can just throw it out. It's, by the way, it's an idea that many people with the sectarian kind of mentality have. They say, let us establish our own pure community and let us live in our own pure community as an ideal kingdom of God, and let us, throw away all those impure other guys who do not match our criteria. This was the idea of many sectarians in the past, and continue to be an idea of many sectarians in the present. Like if you take Donatists, or if you take Melitians in Egypt, in North Africa, who believe that we are the purest kind of community and the rest are rubbish. This is a wrong idea. We have to deal with the scaffolding of the church as an imperfect kind of addition to the church. The church can live without it, as I say, but they are helpful for us as imperfect members of the church, because by improving them, by repairing them, we become better members of the church.
But would you say that in this world, before its fulfillment, so to say, that we have to accept that we need scaffolds?
Yeah, we do need them. I do not disagree with that.
So in some way they would be necessary. And the second part would be then in this question would be for inter-Christian relations, ecumenical relations, so to say, what would be a sustainable scaffolding for such a project, so to say?
Yeah, well, the inter-Christian or ecumenical movement, the ecumenical movement has its own scaffolding, if you want. Even though the ecumenical movement per se is not like the nature of the church, it's not the church per se. It's just a movement of different ecclesial groups who try to restore the unity they once had. But the ecumenical movement has its own scaffolding, and by the way, it often fails. It's not ideal, and that's why they always, try to rethink, revisit those scaffolding. Even if you take, for instance, the World Council of Churches as probably the largest structure that helps the ecumenical movement, it often fails. It's not perfect, and it needs to be kind of criticized and needs to be repaired all the time. So I think this model works for the ecumenical movement as well.
So if one take it one step further, then if so to say, this scaffolding is accidental due to our presence in the world, would it mean that that the church can relate to each other directly through their nature, or is it through the scaffolding that they relate to each other?
Yes, the churches related to each other, if we talk about the local churches, by participating in the common nature of the church. That is another helpful category from the Neoplatonic logic that we may take. Like, for instance, according to this logic, we are all human beings. You, me, John, Sarah, Rebecca, and so forth. They are individual human beings who participate in the common nature. Our participation in the common human nature makes us human beings, human individuals. In the same sense, communities or local churches, they are such hypostases, such individual manifestations of the common nature of the church. They participate in the common nature. They don't need scaffolds to participate in the common nature. However, the scaffolding, the supracommunal structures emerged in the history of the church to facilitate those communities to keep together, to facilitate their participation in the common nature of the church. It means that a community can participate in the common nature of the church without any scaffolding. But when the communities grow, their number grow, and they begin, because they consist of human beings, which are sinful and imperfect, we begin, arguing with each other. We begin anathematizing each other, hating each other, not tolerating each other, and so forth. In such cases, scaffoldings are needed to keep us together, to keep us participating in the common nature of the church. That's why, yes, they are needed for, big, huge ecclesial structures. But they are not a condition sine qua non, not a mandatory condition for a community, for instance, to participate in the common nature of the church. The communities can do it on their own.
So, if you take, for example, the hierarchy or the bishops or priests, deacons, and so on, and if we reflect upon that dimension together with the ecumenical movement, what is the scaffolds here, and what is the nature? Can we be without bishops?
Yes.
Would it be the case that churches without bishop wouldn't taking part in the nature of a church?
Yes. Well, first of all, there were no bishops. Once upon a time, there were apostles who celebrated, who served Eucharist for the church. Then they were substituted by bishops who continued celebrating Eucharist. In this regard, bishops are indispensable from the church as presidents of the Eucharistic communities. At the same time, a particular institution of a bishop emerged in the church under particular historical conditions. It is not given by God. It is not that, the institute of bishops descended from the heaven as, as manna on the Holy Land, and we just enjoy it as something given. No, the church developed this institute in the history, and a particular administrative institute, for instance, institute of a diocese or patriarchate, they are scaffolds of the church in the sense that they emerged in the history in order to facilitate the growth of the communities. Let us remember, in the time of Apostle Paul, there were no patriarchs, there were no, curias, there were no diocesan structures, nothing like that. There were communities, though, and as those communities grew and became complicated, then all those structures became needed, like patriarchates, like dioceses, and so forth, with bishops with the entourage who took care of those communities. And that's how the structures grew. But they are not necessarily for the nature of the church. They are helpful, but not necessarily. They are not embedded in the nature of the church. There is a popular theory among the Orthodox theologians that primacy, for instance, or the institute of the protos stems from God Himself. So it is so deeply rooted in the nature of the church that the church cannot exist without it. No, I think it's wrong. I think the church can exist without all those structures. But that the church can exist without them does not mean that they are not helpful. That they can be helpful. The structures of the church are just a matter of convenience for the church. They are not divine institutions. They are the institutions of convenience.
Conciliarity. Would conciliarity be part of the nature of a church? Is it part of a scaffold, or is conciliarity both part of the nature and part of the scaffolds?
Yeah, I believe conciliarity is an intrinsic part of the nature of the church. The church cannot exist without conciliarity, without gatherings, without meeting for members of the church, either through representation by the bishops, or through other means, like, for instance, the most recent form of the clergy laity councils, clerical ecclesiology, which emerged in the 19th century. It's another form of conciliarity. But the church always needs conciliarity. That's why we believe that the Orthodox Church is the church of the councils, even though we are unable to, to come to a single pan-Orthodox council for centuries now. But we still believe that the church is the church of the councils. There are different forms, though, of councils. If we take the so-called ecumenical councils, they were essentially imperial councils, and they resembled the sessions of the Roman Senate and the Roman court. So the particular forms of councils change, but the church always needed councils. Therefore, I believe conciliarity is a part of the nature of the church.
On the other hand, if you look at the question of these councils, if you look at the diocesan level, would conciliarity be part or a necessary part as the nature of a church on diocesan level? If you think about bishops that hardly gather their priests, hardly have any councils, what would it mean for a church not to have a diocesan gathering?
Yes, because conciliarity, I believe, is a part of the nature of the church. It exists on every level of the church's existence. Either the level of the universal church, or the level of the regional church, or the level of the local church. That's why councils, some forms of conciliarity are needed for every church, either a diocese, or a patriarchate, or the pan-Orthodox councils, or a community. We can find even some rudiments, very kind of traces, very undistinguishable traces of conciliarity, even in the most totalitarian, structures of the church. There are some councils, some forms of conciliarity everywhere. That's why conciliarity survives even the harshest, autocracy in the church, because it belongs to the nature of the church.
If you take, for example, the question of organization, and we take also the question of critique. Is critique part of the nature of a church? And is organization part of the nature or the scaffolding?
No, critique is not a part of the nature. Critique is something that helps to readjust the structures to the nature. The structures deviate from the original meaning of serving the nature, and critique helps these structures to come back to the original meaning. So it's an instrument of bringing or readjusting the structures of the church back to the nature of the church.
And organization, if you take organization also in the sense of a primacy, for example, do we need an organization in the sense that the church per se has an organization? And is that organization including also primacy?
Well, that's exactly my point, that the church does not need desperately an organization, because any organization, the church is a structure, is this accident. The church does not need, in order to provide saving activities to its members. For instance, if you come to a community, to a parish as a parishioner, and you participate in the mysteries, in the sacraments of the church, you do not necessarily need to belong to the parish council in order to be saved. It is helpful if if as an active member you participate in the life of your community, but it's not necessarily. For in the same sense, organization is not something needed, indispensable for the church, but it's something which is helpful for the church. So that's my answer to this question. And there was a question about the primacy. In the same sense, I believe primacy is not a part of the nature of the church. It's not embedded in the church. It's just a helpful instrument to organize the church. I believe there was time when the church did not have a primate. The apostolic times, yes, even though the later perception, for instance, ascribed to Peter the role of the first, but it's a very late perception. I just yesterday read a wonderful book by George Demakopoulos about the perception of the role of Peter in the early church, and he demonstrates very clearly that this role of Peter as the primate among the apostles is very late, is very posterior. It was not kind of shared, believed in the early church. So the church, once upon a time, existed without a primate, and it saved people. So that's why it is possible for the church to exist without primacy.
So would this mean that development is not part of the nature of a church?
Yes. Well, development affects only the structures of the church. The nature of the church does not develop. It is the same. How can you develop the faith in Jesus Christ? How can you develop the sacraments? Yes, you can develop, prayers of sacraments, but how can you change the Eucharist or the baptism? It's all the same. You baptize, you immerse a person 3 times, and you say the baptismal formula. That's it. It doesn't develop. Well, some liturgical forms do develop, of course, but the sacraments as such, they don't.
So it means that in the final eschaton, the scaffolds will be removed.
Yeah, I believe so. Well, and this gives hope, by the way. So what a relief if we know that eventually those scaffolds will be removed and we will see the edifice of the church and its entire beauty.
Let's see if I missed some important question here. What would be the future goal of scaffolding? To remove itself, so to say, or would it be to more clearly make the nature of church visible, or would it be a kind of actualizing the church per se?
Yeah, I believe that until the second coming of Christ, we will have to labor to cope with the scaffolding. We'll have to always to repair them, to improve them, to readjust them to their original purpose, to serve the church, the nature of the church. It's inevitable, something that we cannot escape. We will have to do this Sisyphus labor, unfortunately, and we will be spared of this labor only with the second coming of Christ, when the church will shine in its beauty.
Let's see. I think I have captured, or no. What can be done in order to improve the relation between Rome and the Eastern churches? And I would add also another question also, what could be done in order to improve the international relation between the churches through using a sound scaffolding?
Yes, from the perspective of what I was discussing, what can be done is to identify what is of the primary importance in the church and what is of the secondary importance. To identify the problems to identify different scaffoldings that divided us in the past. Like, for instance, I argue that primacy belongs to the scaffolding. It's not the nature of the church. The Church of Rome, for instance, believes that no, primacy is intrinsic. It is embedded in the nature of the church. Therefore, So far, we've reached, the Orthodox and the Catholics, we've reached the point that we cannot overcome. That for Rome, the primacy of the Bishop of Rome is something you cannot bypass. You just cannot skip it. You cannot keep a blind eye on it. For us, the Orthodox, for majority of us, we disagree on this matter. There is no consensus, but there is an opinion shared by many that primacy is just one of the conveniences in the church. That's why we should not treat the primacy as an absolute value. Before we agree or disagree on this, we cannot proceed in our dialogue. So I believe that discussing scaffolds and the nature of the church is crucial for the future of the ecumenical dialogue. Before we cannot reach any full agreement before we agree on what is the scaffolds and what is the nature of the church. The same applies to the inter-Orthodox relations. I mentioned many examples of how our churches argue with each other about the canonical territories, autocephal, and so forth. Those fights are meaningless, I believe, if we perceive them, those structures, as just scaffolding, not the nature of the church. And we are ready to sacrifice the unity of the church for the sake of those scaffoldings. So one church can break communion with another church just because that church believes that the other church has violated its canonical territory. It's nonsense.
So, will there be bishops in a future coming kingdom?
Of course, it's too an attractive institute to drop out. Of course, as far as people believe in bishops and as far as bishops believe in themselves, they will continue to exist.
That was a very shady way of answering, but the last final question will be the definition of a church, not the ecclesia, if you make that.
Yes.
Are they accidental as part of a scaffolding, or are they an attempt to identify the nature of a church?
Yes, I believe, and I argue this about this in my Ecclesiology book here, that it is impossible to produce a definition of the church. The church cannot be captured in a definition. I believe that the church is like, it's a dynamic reality. It's not a standstill. It's not a still picture. I compare the church with a movie that the pictures always change, and you cannot capture just one cadre of the movie and say this is the movie. No, it's not. It's just one moment in the movie. That's why when you try to define the church, you just capture one of many aspects of the church, and the church will always remain beyond any definition. The church is an amazing phenomenon. It's really very kind of dynamic, very very strong and fast and incapturable, I would say. That's why I think it's a very ambitious but a very unhelpful attempt to define the church.
Okay, we have to close the question and answer section here, because I will invite Bojana to tell us a little bit more about the next lecture. So please, Bojana, the floor or the screen is yours. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Professor Hoverun, and all the participants for inspiring lecture and discussion. So we're continuing with our spring public lecture series in ecclesiology in 2 weeks, precisely from today. So February 18th, same time, 1 p.m. And it will be Dr. Michael Yelm, who will give a lecture on under the name "The Church as an Imperial Republic and Beyond." So we will announce it a week ahead on both our website and social media. And as always, you can apply, and then we will send you a link half an hour before. So thank you once again for being part of this event. And we're looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.